Good morning, students. This is March 2nd. We're at the end of chapter 12 of channel relationships. We started this chapter off talking about one of the two most important things that is required to be able to have a good, firm relationship. And the first is commitment. And the second, we're going to. Now, as I talked about on Tuesday, if you go on to the website and you look up under the general category, you're going to find an article there that I talked about called Commitment and Trust by Morgan and Hunt. And I'm just reviewing this because I talked about it on Tuesday. This is one of the seminal articles that talked about how we go about long-term relationship marketing. And also about how we build committed relationships with the consumers who wish to buy from us. Trust and commitment are keys. And so our Tuesday, we talked about commitment, and today we're going to talk about trust. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Okay, so how do we go about building trust and how do we define trust? Many of you know I've talked about it already that I've been working on an article talking about interpersonal trust and defining trust. How do we use trust or how do we define it in the instances, especially when we're talking about marketing channels? Well, trust is one of those things that's very easy to recognize, but very difficult to define. Uh, Trust, if we were trying to conceptualize it, is the confidence or the willingness to understand that the other party is honest or will act in an honest way. They will stand by their word, they will fulfill obligations. They are sincere in their beliefs and their efforts in order to help us to succeed. Basically, what this comes down is that we accept that the party is benevolent and that they will act in a way in accordance with our best wishes as if there are no other alternatives. In other words, you have this confidence that the other party is generally interested in your own welfare and concerns, and that they will act in a benevolent fashion towards you, hopefully in a way that will help you succeed. And belief is key into this, that we believe these people have our best interests in hands. So, how do we go about creating trust in a relationship? And so, one of the things that any good relationship needs is a concept known as economic satisfaction. So, what is economic satisfaction? It is a positive, affective, which means an emotional feeling, response towards an economic reward that is generated in the channel relationship. Now, if you notice, this isn't a non-emotive or a cognitive response to an economic reward because basically everyone's idea of what they consider to be an economic satisfaction is different. All right, just generally that we have been rewarded in some way in this particular channel relationship financially, no matter what that particular financial reward might be. All right. So, how do we generate this satisfaction? Well, we talked about idiosyncratic investments that are only necessary or part of the relationship itself. Now we're talking about different ones, risky generic investments to channel members. And so a generic investment is one that gives your partners a much broader knowledge, a knowledge that can be used and shared across the spectrum. And so what that means is that they can take that particular that generic investment in knowledge or investment and be able to use it anywhere we wish. Um, but we do that for a purpose because the better that the channel partner performs financially, the more satisfied the partners are, and there's a greater trust in the relationship. In other words, we have to act in ways that provide financial rewards to our partners, and that leads to that affective economic satisfaction that we're hopefully trying to drive. Interpersonal trust is a particular subject that I have been studying, as I said, for the last 5 months, especially when talking about non fungible tokens and also cryptocurrencies. Interpersonal trust, you don't have to know this for the test, but you're talking about two facets. Cognitive trust, where I believe in the institutions and the certifications that this particular partner has, and that gives me confidence in the relationship. That's part of interpersonal trust. The other is affect based. We're going to use that word again. Affect based trust, where we have this emotive connection with the individuals in which we're working with. Um, these are ways that try to help us influence partners in a non coercive way. So, in other words, what we're hopefully trying to do is instead of doing the things like using threats, we want to be able to find ways to help them solve their problems. We want to give them the impression that our relationship, that we are problem solvers together, that in a committed connection together, we're going to do whatever we can to have a satisfying and rewarding relationship by helping you solve your problems. Now, this interpersonal trust, this cognitive and affect based trust, only can exist if we're in a concept or bound in the thought of fairness. And so, what is fairness? We're going to define it in two ways. Fairness is, as well as trust, is acting in a benevolent way, but fairness is bound up into two ways that we act fair. So the first one is called procedural fairness. Now, you might also see the words procedural justice, and they mean the same thing. What is procedural fairness? Procedural fairness is being treated fairly in day to day interactions with your partner. Procedural fairness is being treated fairly in your average day to day interactions. And so, in other words, whenever we are having touch points with our particular partners, those partners are acting in a way that supports us, that those individuals are acting in a way that everything day to day is always going to be the same way, and it's going to be distributive justice means that they are fair, that you're being treated fairly in the distribution of rewards. Those rewards are going to be basically distributed in an equitable manner, irrespective of the size of the particular organizations that you work with. Now, that doesn't mean that larger organizations are not given some other rewards, but usually those are things that are bound by contracts and understandings that increased movement back and forth will create increased rewards. Those two perceptions of fairness, that I'm being treated fairly day to day, and then I'm being treated fairly when the rewards are given out, are absolutely essential for building interpersonal and interorganizational trust. One of the things that's neglected to talk about is that when you are selective in choosing your partner, that also reflects or rebounds to the partners that you select. Um, Having elaborate qualifying strategies to learn about potential partners is actually a good thing, because selectivity is a way of also building trust. Um, some environments are much more conducive to building if the firm has a strong reputation, that it is known for its quality. That is certainly one of the building blocks of cognitive trust. But the truth is that many firms engage in no screening whatsoever, and that all you're doing is just simply finding more conduits to be able to find your way out. Now, it doesn't necessarily minimize trust, but in a selective category, you do find that those that are selected have a greater trust just because the process in and of itself builds it. One of the things that I talked about with franchises with Chick-fil-A was Chick-fil-A, even though the franchise fees are minimal, it takes 4 years to become a franchisee with Chick-fil-A. And a lot of that selectivity builds greater trust between them and the franchisees. So selection is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. It builds on mutual trust. Let me wrap this up in discussion about trust and just basically say that unfairness not only directly undermines the channel partner's trust, but it aggravates and exacerbates the negative effects of any unresolved conflict. And in other words, basically what this means is that unfairness is a catalyst for all of the worst things that you can think of. Remember this is that unfairness is relationship acid. It will destroy any relationship, no matter how deep. Just the uncertainty of knowing whether or not you're being treated fairly will take you on a road that you simply can never recover from. Now, if you notice also on this slide, when it says ensure that you exhibit distributive fairness or procedural justice, once again, remember that if you see fairness or justice on the test, they mean the same thing, all right? So distributive fairness means the same as distributive justice. Procedural fairness means the same as justice. If you act using distributive justice, in other words, if rewards are doled out in an equitable manner, if you have procedural fairness and justice, you treat them the same way every day, then those things build towards greater trust and a greater long-standing relationship. All right, so that's trust. And so we're finally wrapping up into the whole concept of the channel relationship life cycle. Now, I'm going to show you a slide here that talks all about relationships. First off, before we talk about these, I want you to know a couple of things. One of them is that channel relationships and relationships in general are rarely linear. In other words, I'm going to show you something of a timeline, phases that relationships go through from one end to the other, but it doesn't mean that they're always perfect, that they happen sequentially. They don't progress in an orderly fashion. And that's kind of one of the things that you need to take away when we're talking about this, okay? All right, so without further ado, let us talk about the channel relationship life cycle. All right, so we have this wonderful little slide here, and this slide is all 5 of the phases in channel relationships. Ooh, I knocked that out. Excuse me. We can put it back. Okay, sorry. Unintended. Let's do that again. Make sure you're locked in. And here we go. All right. So we have here the 5 phases of marketing channel relationships, and we're going to go through these one at a time. So the first is step 1 is awareness. Now, sometimes in the phase 1 of awareness, we are at a basic understanding of individuals in the system, but it doesn't mean that we are necessarily interacting with them at all. The awareness stage is exactly what it says. It's that we are aware of those individuals out there, whether or not we're in a particular partnership with them at all. We tend to experience transactions perhaps in other domains. We kind of know each other. There's always the potential that they can be future partners, but that that possibility has not realized it. So if when I was a store manager in Lafayette, Louisiana, this was back when you had computer stores. There was us, Omni Computer Store. There was Entree Computer Store. There was Intercom. There was a couple of chains. The managers kind of knew each other. As a matter of fact, the manager for Entree came from Omni, and so we knew each other. We kind of existed in the same circles, but it's not like we were ever interacting with each other. Occasionally, we might ask each other a question. You know, you did that. That's just professional courtesies. Um, but you have networks within each other. All right. You may even recommend one person for another job versus another. I had customers that needed um, IBM service, and I would recommend them to OnTrack. And so this is kind of what the awareness stage is. You see each other as feasible exchange partners. You're not necessarily there yet. You make the parties aware of each other, but you're not there at all. The second stage is exploration. You actually have a reason in one way or another to try to interact with each other that it is potential. What happens is many times is that you will do a test, in other words, to see the viability of these individuals as deeper candidates instead of that you will give them one particular job. You kind of investigate each other, you kind of start interacting with each other, you understand the motivations that each one has. And there's a growing interdependence. You're starting to find that there's important reasons for your relationship with another, and you keep along on that same line. Bargaining becomes very intensive between each other because you start to lay the groundwork of where you ultimately want to be as partners. And so you start to selectively reveal little pieces of yourself and perhaps other things in your interactions. And that selective revealing of information is important because there's the expectation of reciprocity. In other words, I'm vulnerable, I have revealed something about myself, now it's your turn. You sensitive to power and justice because you're still firmly trying to take care and have a connection with who you are and not necessarily giving up more than you wish. You start to have relational norms. In other words, there's an interaction or a daily connection with each other, perhaps, where you start to go into role definitions. They become a little bit more elaborate. And you start to draw inferences from each other, like I can trust this person, or I know this person will get these goods to me at the right and proper time. And so this is the exploration phase. And it's also a phase where there's not enough commitment to make termination difficult. As a matter of fact, it can be fairly easy. Now we come to expansion. And expansion happens at a very, very rapid pace. This is one of those things that I talk about when I say that it's rarely linear. There's a concept that you need to know for the test, and this concept can be found in online. And it is this one right here by Palmentier on relationship philosophy. For those individuals who might be cued on that, Palmentier is the person who wrote the marketing channel strategy. This is one of his salient articles. Journal of Marketing just gives you an idea of the dynamics of this particular guy. And what he basically found is that relationships move in a unique way. In other words, relationships and commitment don't necessarily move linear in fashion, if you remember what I said. What he found is that there's this sliding scale to our commitment as years go. What you find is a rapid increase of commitment. And this is what he called relationship velocity. In other words, the velocity of the relationship can move much faster than a linear fashion, and the velocity can also be negative too. It can move in the opposite direction. And so for the test, know that relationship velocity is the speed in which the commitment of a relationship travels. That's all you need to know for that. Okay. And so if we're moving back to our screen, excuse me, I want to make sure I share this correctly one more time. Again, so expansion, benefits rapidly expand. Relationship velocity takes over, and there starts to be a deeper interdependence. It also means that with your partner, you start taking risks. In other words, there's a willing for you to make a leap of faith and commit yourself greater to these particular individuals. There starts to be a greater satisfaction, both economic and otherwise. It leads to greater motivation and a deepening commitment. And now you start to see goal congruence, where the success of your organization and the success of the other organization start to become tied together. You start communicating because the willingness to expose yourself, you find that you're not as worried as you were at one time whether or not your commitment is going to be reciprocal. Um, you alternate partners look less attractive. It also, this barrier of entry starts coming up because the goodwill and the willingness to be together is so much more valuable now. All right. Um, the key thing also at this point of expansion is you got to maintain the momentum. Each party has to find new areas of activity to maintain these efforts to create these mutual payoffs. Well, I shouldn't say the final stage, but the final expansion upward peaks at commitment. And at commitment, each party is invested in maintaining the relationship. You think of your partner in a long term horizon. You're willing to no longer look at alternatives. You may be aware of them, but you don't court them. And there's a very high expectation on both sides being mutually committed to each other. Organizations like Walmart, connections to Procter and Gamble. There's a high mutual dependence, a high expectation on what the relationship should bring, and very much finally, you have a high trust. You work to resolve your conflicts, and so you truly have functional conflict. You adapt to each other in your changing environment, and you start to share values together. You try, hopefully, to achieve mutual success, which also means that it reinforces mutual dependence. This is the other side of power, if we remember. The key features are adaptability. You're willing to work with the organizations, and loyalty and a commitment. And what you see is a timeline that extends out into the horizon where you don't see an end to that future. Mutual dependence sets these relationships apart. Um, you cleave only to one, and it creates success. Now, the last part of that is disillusion and decline, because everything has an end. Usually, disillusion happens and decline when one party tends to do something in a not committed manner. All right. It can happen in any different way. You can decline to share information that you consider to be important. Um, just basically, you're having a lack of investment, and it provokes the other side to reciprocate. And this is one of the bad things about relationships especially, is the fact is it only takes one side to make the relationship go away. Um, Perhaps it's as it should be, because mutual commitment leads to mutual success. But you see one side provoking the other. The delusion can be abrupt, but it's usually gradual. Um, the key thing about this, as I said, is it takes two to build, but only one to undermine. And decline often sets in without the two parties realizing what's happening. Sometimes it's just basically you wake up in the morning and everything is not the same. Sounds like relationships, doesn't it? So this is how your slides show it. I don't think this is circular in nature. I think it tends to be linear, but it isn't linear in its progress. Okay. Relationship development, as I said before, is rarely linear. It's rarely orderly or sequential. You can go from step one to step three overnight. Um, and it's just something to recognize, is that relationships do not progress in an orderly fashion. And so, how do we manage those relationships? Well, in the early stages, it's important to communicate with our partners. I'll tell you, it sounds fucking silly. Um, and usually, what you communicate is your expertise. This is where you're willing to show some generic investments, where you are willing to share information to give them a common knowledge, which ultimately can lead to some form of betrayal. But in order to build a relationship, you have to give. The next is that you start to make those greater investments. You make those idiosyncratic and generic investments. You do things in which you invest in a relationship that can't be added or used in any other way. And you add to that individual's general knowledge, even to the point where it might put you at risk. In the late stages, one of the things that you tend to do is it tends to be in a nature of avoiding neglect. It tends to be, like servicing more than anything else, is that it needs to be constantly fed to be able to continue to be trusted and important in the relationships. You want to avoid conflict. You especially want to avoid unfairness. um, Ultimately, those will help you maintain long-term relationships. So, as I said, mating relationships require maintenance, and they can wear out even if they're maintained properly. We just know that. And some relationships can better withstand the pressures of suspicion. Just remember, it's all people, all right? And people are flawed and they make difficulties, all right? Now, what do you do? How do you, as a channel member, survive relationships when you know relationships are not perpetual and permanent? This is what you do, and this is a tough question. And it is quite simply, you need a portfolio of channel partners in different phases of channel relationships. And so I have one partner that supplies me with hoses that we're in a long-term committed relationship. And I have another supplier of hoses that I'm just at the awareness phase, and I would like to know how well they're doing. And so I'm starting that, and I start that relationship. I have another relationship that these particular corporations have actually moved on, and perhaps they had conflict in their channel systems, and they no longer want to sell the systems that I had originally bought from them. So they're moving out. And so this is how you manage relationships. You have relationship portfolios of channel partners in different stages of relationships, and this ultimately diversifies risk across the channel environment. I do not urge you to try this in your personal life. All right? Try. So, anyway, here we are at the end of chapter 12. I hope I've enlightened you a little bit. You've been a very pleasurable class. I wish you all much success. If there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. If I can write that letter of recommendation or help you puzzle out something, making it through your undergraduate degree, let me know. All right. Take care, folks. I'll see you.